You ever notice how the world starts to look different when the sun hasn't quite decided to show its face yet? That gray, hazy hour where the shadows seem a little too long and the air carries a chill that bites right through a denim jacket? Out here in the high plains of Wyoming, silence, ISN, and oppos. Just a lack of noise. It's a living thing, a heavy blanket of peace that I've spent the last 12 years cultivating on this patch of dirt I call the Broken Spur. But on a Tuesday in early October, that silence didn't end oppos. Just break. It shattered, and it started with a sound that didn't end oppos. Belong in the symphony of the prairie. I was standing in the kitchen, the smell of burnt coffee filling the room while my two old ridgebacks, Blue and Goose, were staring at the front door with their hackles up like a row of jagged mountain peaks. And when I looked out that window, I didn't end oppos. See the usual stray elk or a neighbor's wandering steer. I saw a matte black SUV with dark tinted windows crawling up my 3-mile driveway with its lights off, moving like a predator through tall grass. Now, you have to understand, my gate has a sign that's been there since the day I bought this place, a piece of rusted iron that says, in quote, private property. No trespassing, no soliciting, no exceptions, in quote. But these boys didn't in oppos. Seemed to have a talent for reading because they rolled right past it, parked near my equipment shed, and 3 men stepped out looking like they were auditioning for a low-budget action movie. They had these tactical vests that looked like they still had the creases from the packaging, clipboards in hand, and a sense of entitlement so thick you could smell it over the sagebrush. And as I watched them start snapping photos of my century-old barn and my irrigation pivots, a cold, hard knot started tightening in the pit of my stomach. I didn't end oppos. Reached for my phone to call the authorities because out here the sheriff is 40 minutes away on a good day, and by the time he arrives, the damage is usually done. So I grabbed my keys, stepped into my boots without even lacing them, and headed out the door with Blue and Goose at my heels, their low growls vibrating in my own chest. I fired up the old Polaris Ranger, the engine coughing a cloud of blue smoke into the morning air, and I drove down to meet them, cutting the engine just a few feet away, so the only sound was the wind whistling through the fence wires and the ticking of the cooling metal. The leader of the pack, a guy with a haircut that cost more than my first truck and a pair of mirrored sunglasses that reflected the sunrise like a bug's eyes, didn't end oppos. To even flinch, he just tapped his clipboard and looked at me like I was a squatter on my own land, saying in quote, Mr. Miller, I presume? I'm Marcus Thorne, Chief Compliance Officer for the Juniper Ridge Estates Oversight Committee, and we're here to conduct a mandatory visual inspection of your structures and perimeter fencing for code violations, end quote. I just stared at him for a long beat, the kind of silence that makes a man shift his weight, before I said, end quote. Well, Marcus, that's a real fancy title for someone who's standing on private ranch land that has end oppos. Seen a code inspector since the Roosevelt administration. And unless you've got a search warrant signed by a judge, you're about 30 seconds away from a very uncomfortable conversation with the local law, end quote. He actually had the nerve to smirk, a slow, oily movement of his lips, and he held up a piece of paper with a gold seal on it, claiming they'd been granted, end quote, emergency annexation authority, end quote, due to some obscure wildfire mitigation ordinance, telling me my wooden fences were a fire hazard and my cattle troughs were breeding grounds for invasive mosquitoes. It was a lie, a beautiful high-gloss lie, and I knew exactly what this was. It was a land grab dressed up in a suit and tie, because my ranch sits right on the edge of a new development where they're selling half-acre lots for $500,000, and I was the only thing standing between them and a paved road to the highway. Things turned ugly fast when one of Thorne's goons, a twitchy kid who looked like he'd never seen a cow in person, decided he was going to, end quote, confiscate, end quote, a sample of my well water, and as he lunged toward the pump, my youngest calf, a little red-white face we call Scout, got spooked and tried to leap the gate, but the wood was old and the kid was clumsy. He shoved a heavy plastic crate into the fence line to block the calf, and the timber snapped with a sound like a gunshot, sending Scout tumbling into a mess of splintered pine and rusted barbed wire. And the scream that little animal let out is something I'll hear in my dreams until the day I die. My blood didn't in oppos. Just boil, it turned to ice, and I didn't in oppos. Say a word, I just walked over to the main gate control on the shed wall and hit the heavy iron lever. And with a thunderous clatter, The 2-ton steel gates at the end of the driveway slid shut and locked with a magnetic click that echoed across the valley. I looked Thorne dead in the eyes and said, and quote, "You want to talk about codes and violations? Fine, we'll talk, but you're doing it from the inside of that barn because as of right now, your vehicle is evidence in a felony property damage and animal cruelty investigation, and I've already sent the GPS coordinates to the county prosecutor." End quote. They tried to bluster, tried to claim I was kidnapping them, but when Blue and Goose stepped forward, showing 3 inches of tooth and eyes that didn't end oppose, know the meaning of mercy, the 3 of them backed into the barn like whipped dogs. And I slid the heavy wooden doors shut, dropped the crossbar, and went to tend to my calf. The next few hours were a blur of adrenaline and cold calculation as I sat in the dirt with Scout's head in my lap, waiting for the vet while the men in the barn shouted threats that grew quieter as the sun got higher and the heat started to bake the tin roof. And that's when my old friend Elias pulled up in his dusty Chevy. Elias is a man who knows where every body is buried in this county, a retired surveyor who can read a land deed like most people read the Sunday comics. And when I showed him the annexation paper Thorne had given me, he started laughing so hard he nearly choked on his tobacco. End quote. Jed, end quote, he said, wiping his eyes, end quote. This paper is about as legal as a $3 bill. That gold seal is a sticker you can buy at any office supply store, and the man who supposedly signed this died in a fishing accident 3 years ago. They're not just trying to bully you, they're running a professional shakedown. End quote. We spent the afternoon in my kitchen, fueled by black coffee and a shared sense of righteous fury, digging through old county records Elias had brought on a thumb drive, and what we found was a rabbit hole that went deeper than I ever imagined. Thorne wasn't into oppos. Just a, end quote, compliance officer, end quote. He was a brother-in-law of the lead developer for Juniper Ridge, and they'd been using these fake patrols to harass elderly landowners into selling for pennies on the dollar, using forged maps that showed property lines shifting by 50 or 100 feet every year until the owners just gave up. When the sheriff finally arrived, a man named Miller who'd been my neighbor for a decade, he didn't in oppos. He just bring a patrol car. He brought a tow truck and a scowl that could peel paint off a wall, and as he opened that barn door and saw Thorne sitting on a hay bale looking like a wilted lily, the look on his face was pure poetry. Thorne tried to act like the victim, shouting about, end quote, unlawful detainment, end quote, and, end quote, hostile rancher mentalities, end quote, but the sheriff just held up a plastic bag containing the chunk of raw, blue-tinted meat I'd found near my dog's water bowl an hour earlier. Poison, the same kind they use for coyotes, hidden in the shadows of my porch. End quote. Marcus, end quote, the sheriff said, his voice as dry as a desert wind, end quote. You've got 3 choices. You can talk to me now about the forgery and the animal cruelty, or you can talk to the FBI about the interstate wire fraud we found on that burner phone you dropped in the hay. But either way, you're leaving this ranch in handcuffs, end quote. The look of total, crumbling realization on Thorne's face as he looked from the sheriff to the poisoned meat to the heavy steel gates was the most satisfying thing I'd seen in a decade. The predator finally realizing the trap had been set for him the moment he stepped off the pavement. But the victory wasn't in oppos. Just in the arrests. It was in the fallout that followed, because we didn't in oppos. Just let the law handle it. We took the story to the people, and within 48 hours, the local Facebook groups and the county newspaper were flooded with photos of Scout's injury, the forged maps, and the financial record Elias had helped me unearth. We found out they'd stolen nearly $3 million in, end quote, compliance fines, end quote, from unsuspecting families, money that was being funneled into a shell company in the Caymans. And by the end of the week, the Juniper Ridge project was in oppos. Just halted. It was under a federal seizure order. The board of directors for the development firm resigned in a panicked scramble, turning on each other like rats on a sinking ship, and the end quote. Emergency ordinance, end quote, they tried to use against me was struck down by a circuit court judge who called it the most egregious example of corporate overreach he'd seen in 30 years on the bench. Now, life on the Broken Spur has returned to its usual rhythm. The silence is back. But it's a different kind of quiet now, a solid, earned peace that comes from knowing the fences are strong and the neighbors are watching each other in oppos. S backs and Scout is limping a bit, but he's growing into a fine young bull with a spirit that won into Oppos. TB broken. I still see Thorne's name in the legal notices sometimes, as the lawsuits pile up and the prison sentence looms, and I wonder if he ever thinks about that Tuesday morning, about the rancher who didn't into Oppos. T panic and the gates that didn't into Oppos. T open. It makes you think, doesn't into Oppos. T it? How many of these in quote, authorities in quote, are only powerful because we've been taught to be polite, to respect the clipboard and the uniform, even when our gut tells us something is wrong. I decided a long time ago that my land is more than just dirt and grass. It's a promise I made to the generations before me and the ones coming after, and I'll be damned if I let a man in a black SUV tell me otherwise. What would you have done if you saw those headlights in your driveway at 4 in the morning? Would you have called for help and waited? Or would you have handled it at the gate? There's a fine line between being a good neighbor and being a doormat, and I think a lot of us are starting to realize that the line is carved in stone out here in the West. Drop a comment below and let me know if you've ever had to deal with an HOA or a local board that thought they owned your backyard. I want to hear your stories because the only way we stop people like Thorne is by shining a light on them together. Thanks for listening to An Old Man in Oppos. S story. Stay safe out there and keep your gates locked.